The second thing that needs to be changed that will be a little bit more involved has got to do with this splinter shield over here. It turns out that these vertical lines are actually stanchions for a railing that is for some reason installed on the outside of the splinter shield. That being said, they are too thick and are out of scale and can be removed. Furthermore, there should be 2 dips in this shield for saluting cannons, with a railing that runs along the full length of the top. Although I think this will be a bit difficult to correct, I'm going to attempt it anyway, because I'm not happy with this area of the ship. There is a seam line between these 2 parts which needs to be removed. The reason why I hadn't removed it was because I was trying to preserve this detail. And in some areas there were connection points, injection points for the plastic into this part that were between these fine lines, and that made it difficult to get a nice clean defined line. To fix this area, what I'll do is fill this section that is flush with putty, so I can create a nice smooth surface. On the section that steps off a bit, I will file off the detailed lines. And then I'll take a section of 2-rung railing, similar to this, cut off the 2 lower rungs, and use that to replace these vertical lines in the plastic, while keeping the top rung in place so that it can span the dips for the saluting cannons. Before applying the putty, I'm going to mask off the area. There are some details in this area that I need to preserve. Mainly it's the wriggles for the portholes. So I'll just cover that with tape such that any excess putty can be easily removed by simply removing the tape. I then apply plastic putty to the splinter shield using a toothpick. This doesn't need to go on that thick. I'm just going to be filling the gaps between these stanchions. The way this part was molded has the splinter shield sitting back a bit from the section of superstructure immediately below it. That is actually incorrect. That should be flush and the stanchions should stick out. At least that's what it looks like from the pictures that I've seen. So to correct this area, what I will do is fill the gaps between the plastic stanchions with plastic putty and then sand it off so that it's flush with the superstructure. The starboard side of the ship has the same problem. So I'll repeat the process over there, fill up the gaps with plastic putty, and then wait for the putty to harden so that I can file it flush. After leaving the putty to harden for around a day, it's ready to be filed. I start with a bar file, which is fairly rough, and I use that to remove the majority of the putty and some of the plastic on the stanchions to get it flush. And once it is approximately flush, I then switch over to sanding sponges, and I move through 240 grit and 400 grit sandpaper to finish the surface. You'll also notice that I place a piece of tape on this section of the superstructure. The reason for that is so that this corner gets preserved when I sand in this area. Obviously, if that tape wasn't there when I'm sanding, I would smooth out that corner and then that detail would be lost. I want to maintain a crisp line over there, so I place the tape on it so that when I sand, it doesn't remove that corner. Once I'm happy with the state of the splinter shield where I apply the putty, I then move on to working on this area that juts out from the superstructure. This is obviously considerably easier. I don't need to fill this with putty. I simply need to sand off the stanchions. So once again, I reach for my trusty bar file to do the majority of the work, following which I clean it up a little bit more with 400 grit sandpaper. Since this is quite a prominent area of the ship, I want to be sure that the surface is good. So before I paint it, I'm going to spray this area with Mr. Surfacer 500 just to help fill any micro scratches and to reveal any serious defects that need to be corrected. So I quickly tape off the area and then spray it. There are some minor defects, especially in that corner where the section of the splinter shield sticks out. That's easy enough to correct with a little bit of sanding and then a respraying, and I'm then happy with the finish. Before I move on to the next step, which is to cut dips into the splinter shield for the saluting cannons, I need to cut out a section of railing, because it's the segments of the railing that are going to help me align the dips. The ideal railing to use here would be 1-rung railing, I suppose, but I don't have anything like that. I don't even have appropriate 2-rung railing, so I have to go with this appropriately sized 3-rung railing. The segments are about the right size, and also its height is correct. But the problem is that I need to keep the stanchions, but remove the bottom 2 railings. This is a bit tricky, but it is doable if you have a sharp blade. So I replaced my hobby knife blade with a new one, and then carefully proceeded to cut out the extra rungs on this railing. This was a bit tedious, but I think the end result is going to be worth it. The photo etch is so much more fine than the plastic that I think that alone will make it worth it, let alone the other issues that I had with the seam line not being able to be correctly filled and those connection areas for the part to the sprue that I couldn't properly dig the plastic out of. This is just going to clean up everything so much. So I go through the pane and I cut out these sections of railing, and I use that to mark off segments to help me align the dips for the saluting cannon. The one at the front actually turns out to be quite simple. I'm using the width of my file as the width of the dip for the saluting cannon. It just makes things easy, and it's approximately the correct width anyway. And I also know that it is lined up right up against the section of the splinter shield that goes up to the platforms for the 1/2-inch guns. The second dip for the saluting cannon is a little bit more complicated. That needs to be aligned a certain number of segments away from the part of the splinter shield that sticks out, and approximately at the edge of the shelter for the signalman. To mark off the location for these dips, I use a hobby knife to cut a groove into the top of the splinter shield. After marking the locations for the dips, I then cut them into the splinter shield using a bar file. Now that the dips are in, I can go about installing the photo etch onto the splinter shield. These parts line up actually remarkably well. I was quite lucky to find a section of railing that essentially perfectly fits this area. Provided I started correctly and I have the very first stanchion right on the edge of the splinter shield, this will all work out. So I spend a bit of time to correctly position it, and then I glue it down using extra thin super glue that I apply using a wire. I then carefully work my way along the length of the railing, ensuring that it is properly stuck down. When I get to the corner where the splinter shield sticks out from the railing, I use my finger to bend the railing into the correct shape, and then continue to mold the railing around the curved section of the splinter shield. And as I complete this process, you can see what I mean by it is the perfect fit, because somehow, rather miraculously, the very last stanchion lands on this corner. This railing is excess railing that I got from my RN Roma kit. Since that process went so well, I then simply repeat it for the other side, and I get the exact same result. A result that I am very happy with. Now that all the tricky work is done, it's simply a matter of spraying this area with XF53 to bring its color back into line with the rest of the superstructure for HMS hood. And as I do that, the photo etch and the plastic blend together and create a really nice effect. This is so much better than what was there before. I am very glad that Pennant51 updated his guide on the HMS Hood Association's website to include this detail. It really gave me the excuse that I needed to revisit this area of the ship and correct it. In the next video, I'll continue to work with photo etch, and I'll be installing ladders and railings on this lower portion of the superstructure. If you would like to support this channel or see how this ship looks when it is completed, then please subscribe. Thanks for watching. Cheers.